Today, we'll be talking about accessibility and equity. This is a part 3 of a 3-part series, the intersection of disability and human trafficking. In part 1 of this 3-part series on accessibility and equity, a basic understanding of disability groups was introduced, and best practices for interacting with people within these groups were discussed. Part 2 centered around creating accessible online spaces, including websites and Zoom meetings. Part 3, the final presentation in this series, will be discussing the intersection of disability and human trafficking, including vulnerabilities and improving the provision of services within this intersection. Disability affects approximately 61 million, or nearly 1 in 4 people in the United States, and more than 1 billion people worldwide. In 2021, 10,359 situations of human trafficking were reported to the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline, involving 16,554 individual victims. The vulnerabilities faced by individuals with disabilities are embedded in a broader framework of oppression, encompassing structural, interpersonal, and individual forms of discrimination. While the experiences of people with disabilities differ significantly based on the specific nature of their disabilities and other contextual factors, research suggests that structural oppression can manifest as challenges in securing fair paying employment, sustaining employment, and coping with elevated healthcare expenses. The broader body of research literature finds lack of living wage employment, inaccessibility of healthcare, and poverty as being associated with trafficking risk among the general population. Factors that make people with disabilities vulnerable to trafficking. People with disabilities often rely on others to meet their basic needs. These caregivers have opportunities to traffic them as a result. People with disabilities may become submissive to the caregivers and comply with their caregivers' wishes because they are so dependent on them. This learned response makes the unequal power in dynamic in relationship with the trafficker, even if the trafficker is abusive, seem normal. People with disabilities may lead isolated lives and crave friendship and human connection. Isolation can make it difficult or impossible for people with disabilities to make contact with people who could help them. People with disabilities may not be believed if they report abuse and violence. And these are just a few factors that make people with disabilities vulnerable to trafficking. Individuals who fall victim to human trafficking can potentially acquire disabilities due to the abuse inflicted upon them by their traffickers. Additionally, those with pre-existing disabilities might be deliberately targeted by traffickers due to their increased vulnerability. Unfortunately, many human trafficking task forces often overlook this significant risk factor or neglect to establish adequate safeguards and support systems for individuals with disabilities. The National Human Trafficking and Disabilities Working Group conducted a needs assessment among service providers in the disability community and service providers in the anti-trafficking community to learn more about the prevalence of individuals with disabilities who have experienced trafficking. The following slides include key information pulled directly from the report. The full report, including the survey questions, can be found on their website as seen below. The mission of the National Human Trafficking and Disabilities Working Group is to promote a survivor-centered, collaborative approach steeped in disability and racial justice for the prevention of trafficking of individuals with disabilities and deaf individuals, to advance the health and well-being of trafficking survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors of trafficking, and to ensure an accessible and appropriate response to survivors through research, policy analysis, technical assistance, and training. The working group is a volunteer-run collaboration that consists of experts and self-advocates from both human trafficking and disability communities. Why launch the survey? The NHTDWG was formed because experts and advocates in the field of human trafficking and the field of disability acknowledge that people with disabilities and deaf individuals were increasingly at risk of being trafficked. Yet the intersection between human trafficking and disabilities was not often talked about. NHTDWG decided to launch the National Data and Assessment Survey to gain data on the level of understanding of human trafficking and disabilities, and to find out if disability was something human trafficking service providers were screening for, and if disability service providers were aware of and screening for human trafficking. A few of the key goals of the survey included to determine if data is being collected at this intersection in direct service organizations, including demographics of participants and consumers, to determine if direct service providers are assessing for all forms of trafficking and for all types of disability, and to determine how direct service providers are assessing for all forms of trafficking and for all types of disability. So for this survey, 49 service providers completed the survey. Of those 49 service providers, 59% were identified as disability providers and 41% identified as human trafficking providers. All participants were asked about their screening practices related to the intersection of disability and human trafficking. Of the disability providers surveyed, only one indicated that their organization screened participants for human trafficking, and 3 indicated that they have personally screened participants for human trafficking. Although only one participant reported that their organization provided a training about human trafficking, 93% of respondents reported being interested in receiving training about human trafficking. Of the 29 disability providers, 38% reported that they did receive trauma-informed care training at their organization. Providers were asked if their organization partnered with an anti-human trafficking agency, collaboration, or survivor working group, and 79% responded no. For the human trafficking professionals, of the human trafficking professionals surveyed, only 25% reported that their organization requires all participants to be screened for disability, while 55% of human trafficking professionals reported that their organization did not require training on disability or how to communicate with people with disabilities. Almost all, 95% respondents, expressed they were interested in receiving training regarding disability. When asked about trauma-informed care, 85% of the respondents indicated that their organization required them to be trained on trauma-informed care at some point during their employment. When asked if their organization partnered with an agency, organization, or a working group in the disability and/or deaf community, 55% responded no. The intersection between disability and human trafficking. When asked, in your work with individuals with disabilities or who are deaf, what initiatives do you see needed in order to support survivors of human trafficking with disabilities or deafness? The most common response from disability providers were related to training and education about human trafficking awareness and recognizing warning signs or red flags of human trafficking. When asked, in your work with those who experience trafficking, what initiatives do you see needed in order to improve identification survivors of trafficking with disabilities or deafness? The most common response from human trafficking professionals was related to disability screening and assessment methods and making services more accessible for individuals with disabilities. Limitations of this study, future initiatives, and research. Despite its small sample, the results of the needs assessment clearly highlight the need for more training and education on the intersection of human trafficking and disabilities among both disability and human trafficking providers. There is also an evident need for increasing and improving screening of clients for human trafficking and disabilities and enhancing collaboration between human trafficking and disability organizations. This NHTDWG needs assessment only serves as an initial data collection to understand the policy and program needs for survivors with disabilities. So in closing, the limited amount of research available on the intersection of disability and human trafficking clearly shows that not enough thought or efforts have been given to this topic. It is my hope that by shedding light on this disparity, awareness amongst our survivor community will aid in a broader understanding and ultimately a more inclusive approach to providing accessibility and equity. This is a complete list of the references. Primarily, this information was taken from the survey that was by the let's see. By the National Human Trafficking and Disabilities Working Group, NHTDWG.